This is the Citizen of Heaven podcast, the Idolatry episode. I am Hal Hammons, and I am a citizen of heaven, and I am your embedded correspondent in Satan's world. I bring in this message of hope today from Pensacola, Florida. This is report number 49, dated March 10th in the year of our Lord 2020. I bid God's grace and peace to all my fellow sojourners here in this earthly plane. I remain sound in body, alert in mind, and energized in spirit. In this week's podcast, we will discuss the modern versions of pagan worship. I've been preaching about the appeal of idols. As strange as it may seem to me, clearly people have been always drawn toward idol worship. Let's talk about why. I've been reading Hawaii by James Michener. Celebrating our culture is fine, but cultures are rarely found in complete harmony with God's will. At some point, we'll have to make a choice. I've been hearing American Idol is still on the air. We quit watching it years ago, mostly because the show celebrates everything that's wrong with our society. I've been playing Bora Bora, which in our minds steers clear of actually honoring pagan gods. It's a fine line to walk. I'll share exactly how I walk it. Are you ready? Here we go. This is what I've been preaching. Idolatry may not seem like the most relevant topic, the most relevant Bible topic that we could come up with. And in a conventional sense, in a biblical sense, the way that idolatry is presented in the Old Testament, maybe not. But idolatry is alive and well. There are very definitely aspects to pagan culture and pagan practices that live and breathe today. And I'm not talking about faraway corners of the world. I'm talking about Main Street. I'm talking about America, my hometown, your hometown. Idols take all kinds of different forms, of course. The idol of self, the idol of money, the idol of covetousness. These are as old as humanity, older than graven images, in fact. Why is it that idol worship has been so consistently practiced in the world? And going back to the nation of Israel particularly, why is it that a nation that was blessed over and over again by the one true God, that celebrated the one true God, worshiped the one true God, saw manifestations of that God in ways that you and I are never going to experience? Parting of the Red Sea, the Mount Sinai spectacle, all the rest of that. How could they turn on that one God and serve other gods? And the simple answer is that one generation did not teach the next, that the children did not listen to the stories of their elders, or else the elders didn't tell those stories. And eventually there arose a generation that knew not Joshua, or knew not Joseph, or whatever. And they had separated themselves, consciously or unconsciously, from the one true God. Maybe that's partly because of education. Maybe that's partly because of an inherent desire and craving, in fact, for something beyond this world. If it's not going to be the God of heaven, surely it's got to be something else. I have some theories as to why this happened, and you can take this for what it's worth. I'll offer it to you for your consideration. I think that at least in part, the carnality of idol worship in times past must play some kind of role. Many of the gods were fertility gods, which is to say sex gods. And serving these idols served a very real and substantial short-term benefit in the minds of the worshipers. I'm sure that was at least part of that, because obviously that kind of cult had no place with the one true God. There's no doubt an appeal to a shallow sort of faith. The God of heaven, of course, does not manifest himself in physical form. He condemned, in fact, the making of graven images. And there is something about us that rejects faith. We want to have something that we can hold on to, something we can see, something we can touch. It makes a difference. Maybe in that way, these pagan gods were more appealing than the invisible God of heaven. But I suspect that a big part of it is just ego. That we like the idea of something that we can hold, something we can grab, something that we ourselves had a part in, that we made it. And we made it not just in a physical way, but we made it in a spiritual way as well. A God after our own devisings, as it were. We make the statue look like we want it to look. We make the altar look like we want it to look. And again, that applies to our versions of idolatry today just as much as any other version of idolatry. When we are able to craft a God after our own devising, that means that we can devise truth. We can reject the truth of the God of heaven because we can make our own truth. This is seen in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 26 and following. Consider your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong, and the base things of the world and the despised things God has chosen, the things that are not, so that he may nullify the things that are, so that no man may boast before God. And that last verse there is the key. We don't get to boast because God has truth. God has wisdom. And we don't like the idea of surrendering this knowledge of everything important to somebody else. We want to believe that we are the source of truth. And that means rejecting God's truth. We can declare success however we like the one talent man who buried his talent in the sand and said, look how good a job I did. We like to declare winners and losers, especially when we're the winners. We like to say, what I did is good enough. When you accept the invisible God of heaven, you can't do that. You have to accept his idea of success and failure as well, and accountability. We are going to be judged according to the things that we've done. The text says in Romans chapter 2, verse 6, you may not like being subject to the judgment of some invisible power out there. And so therefore, maybe rejecting that power, you can come to grips with the idea of serving a God of your own making, because he's going to be nice to you. He's going to approve the things that you're doing because you decided what you were going to do and what was appropriate to do. Faith calls us to the one true God and the one true form of worshiping that God. We're not going to be able to satisfy ourselves with anything less. That is a blow to our ego. That is a blow to our own understanding, to accept the idea that there's one greater than us, there's one wiser than us. But knowing that one God is going to bring us into a relationship with that one God and the blessing that only that one God can provide. The blow to our ego is a price that we should be more than willing to pay, considering what we're going to get out of that one God. Far more than we would ever get out of sticks and stones and chunks of metal. Anyway, that's what I've been preaching. This is what I've been reading. I did not read the entirety of the novel Hawaii by James Michener last week. If I give the impression I read a book a week on this podcast, I apologize. That's not true, especially when the book is as epic in every sense of the word as Hawaii is. These are the way Michener's books tend to be, at least the ones that I've read. They take a place like Hawaii or Poland or Texas or Alaska, and they dig into the backstory, where the culture came from, where the various cultures came from, the rises and falls, and how humanity interacted with the land in these various places. In the case of Hawaii, humanity came to Hawaii from Bora Bora, from the islands of the South Seas. A boat full of people got onto the, I'm going to spare you most of the backstory. They got into a huge canoe and they traveled, and they wound up landing in the islands of Hawaii. And they brought with them their gods. That's one of the reasons why they had left Bora Bora, because new gods had come in. And they wanted to hold to their old gods, and they weren't welcome in their old culture anymore. So they took these gods, and when I say gods, I'm talking about rocks. A couple of rocks, hand-sized rocks, with them. They took them in the boat with them, and they traveled to this new place that they hoped existed. They didn't know for sure. They'd never seen it. And they landed, and they built their society there. And as time went on, and as eventually evangelists from the east coast of the United States sailed all the way around South America and landed in Hawaii and tried to teach them about the one true God, teach them about the Bible, they were very receptive to this, because the idea of exchanging one God for another was common to them. They accepted that. The idea of one God being stronger than another, and therefore you serve the stronger God, well, of course, that's the way they always had done in their society. It didn't mean that the original God didn't exist, or that they didn't love that God, or they didn't even serve that God in some aspect. They wanted to hold to it to a certain degree. It was who they were. It was part of their culture. And so therefore, when the Hawaiian people embraced Jesus Christ, and they came to him in some fashion at least, there was still this understanding that, yes, we serve God, we serve Jesus, we love Jesus, but we love our gods too. And in these early days, the early decades, and even the early century or so of Hawaiian development, this was a very difficult thing to to balance in their minds. And the evangelists, the missionaries that went over there really struggled with this, the idea of only one God. The people just seem to not embrace this at all. And on the final page, as the history brings us up to the modern day, to the 20th century, one of the characters that has been part of this family, that has some Native Hawaiian lineage and is part of this culture that had this amalgam of societies that had come about, he still has this rock that had existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, that had to a certain degree been preserved by his culture. It was still there. Now, he wasn't sacrificing goats to this rock anymore. There wasn't what we would call worship, but there was a certain amount of veneration because it was part of his culture. It was part of who he was. And the implication from the novel is that's a good thing. You don't give up on your roots. You don't quit on your roots just because you grow out of the baser elements of that. It's an interesting story, and it's an interesting take on the role that idols play in a culture. We as children of God, hopefully at least, embrace the idea, welcome the idea that Jesus Christ replaces all other affiliations completely. And we look down our noses, as a rule, at pagan nations, as we may call them, pagan nations, or nations that still have very crude ceremonies, ugly and even violent ceremonies in honor of their one true, their gods as they understand them. We have so much a better path here. And isn't it great to be civilized like Americans are? Well, I want to suggest to you that being an American Christian can be just as paganistic, just as idol worshipy, if you will, as any other God, as any other society. We, as the people of God in America, also cling to this idea of being Americans. And we have bought into the idea that being an American is compatible with and even the same as being a Christian. There may be a certain danger in getting it 50% right, or 80% right, or 90% right. We are celebrated as a Christian nation and have been for a long, long time. You may define that in one way or another. You may agree with that or not agree with that. But certainly there is a place in our culture for Jesus Christ that does not and has not existed in many other cultures. It has always been. We didn't grow to become like this. We were made this way. This is how we were born, with an understanding of Jesus Christ and his principles. We have deviated from those in many instances, of course, but this has always been the core of the American culture. And so therefore we buy into the idea that being a good American is the same thing as being a good Christian. That is not true. That never has been true. And there's going to come times in our culture also, our society, where we have to reject the way we were brought up. We have to reject the things that our culture stands for. Things like chasing after wealth, things like me first, and survival of the fittest, and big business, and all these cultural icons that to a certain degree we embrace and we celebrate in our culture that may not be compatible with Jesus Christ. The time's going to come for us, just as well as any other society, to put fresh wine in fresh wineskins. As Jesus says in Luke chapter 5, verse 38. We have to agree to follow Jesus when his philosophy is not compatible with our local philosophy. We have to give up our gods. There is only one God. It's not going to be carnality. It's not going to be sex. It's not going to be the almighty dollar, if you will. It's going to be the God of heaven that is presented and celebrated, and to whom we are drawn through the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's certainly not going to be the God of our belly, the God of our appetite that Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 3, verse 19. It's not going to be what serves our own short-term physical best interest. We are called to serve something higher, something nobler, something more spiritual. That is not going to be compatible with your physical lifestyle. That is not going to be compatible with your carnal culture. At some point in that day, you have to worship the God of heaven instead of worshiping your idol. May God give us the strength to make a good choice in those days. Anyway, that's what I've been reading.
This is what I've been hearing.
American Idol recently entered into, I think, its 18th season. We've watched a little less than half of them we gave up several years ago. It's not that we think American Idol is sinful inherently. That's not the point at all. Please don't take that away from this podcast. That's not the point. But we did not feel like we were getting very much out of it of a positive nature. It was repetitive. It was, to a certain degree, degrading. If you haven't seen American Idol, it's a talent competition. People are singing their way to the top, at least in theory. They're trying to make it big in the music industry and taking tremendous shortcuts in so doing, and singing great songs and putting on performances and competing against one another, and they get voted off, and eventually there is a winner who supposedly is going to get this big record contract and make it big. In reality, it doesn't work that way. There have been 2, maybe 3 actual breakout stars that have come from American Idol in all these years. It's not anything remotely resembling a factory for success in the industry. What it does a fairly decent job of is create celebrities, at least B-list or C-list celebrities. It's not about becoming a great musician or a popular musician. It's much more about becoming famous. And that's part of the idol aspect of American Idol, I think. It celebrates the things that I find most appalling in our culture. And consider my thoughts for what they're worth. The American Idol is idolizing fame. It's saying that you need to be famous. That is inherently a good thing to be popular and famous and well-known, have your pictures all over billboards and such. Like they used to, it doesn't have to be attached to any real talent or ability or appearance or anything like that necessarily. Kind of like they used to say about John F. Kennedy Jr. He was famous for being famous. Being famous is the important thing, to a lot of people at least. For those who are genuinely interested in a career in the music industry, it is a fast track. You instead of putting in your hours and your years and working the clubs and working your way up and seeing the right people and making sacrifices and such, if you can have a really, really good few months, 3, 4, 5 months, or however long it takes, if you can manage to make it through the auditions and make it through the appearances and appear good on TV, you might be able to get tremendous success in a very short period of time. There's not like there isn't a payoff for the winner. In the worst case scenario, there is a very, very good payoff. So there's something to that. And also to a certain degree, I think you have to accept, and I don't want to get into a big lecture about popular music in this particular forum. We'll talk about that maybe another time. But there is a very real sense in which this concept, and many of the songs in particular, are celebrating what is ugly and depraved about our lifestyle. And I'm not just talking about popular music or heavy metal or anything, country music is the same way. There is an awful lot of drinking. There's a lot of fornication. There's a lot of cheating, etc., etc. Not every song by any means, but not only have we given up listening to watching the television, regular network programming, I've almost completely given up listening to popular music. It's not worth it anymore. I'm not protesting it. Listen to what you want to listen to, but realize that we are Christians. We are in Satan's world, and we're listening to Satan's entertainment. And at a certain point, you be the judge of where that point is. At a certain point, we become celebrating the things that are ugly, the things that are sinful in our society, celebrating a depraved and ungodly lifestyle instead of standing up as Christians in a lost and dying world. Bible principles, Bible values are in many ways exactly the opposite of American Idol. The Bible exhorts us to work for a living, to work hard, in fact. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse number 18, 19, and 20. Here is what I have seen to be good and fitting to eat, to drink, and to enjoy oneself in all one's labor, in which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life which God has given him, for this is his reward. Furthermore, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. For he will not often consider the years of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of his heart. Working hard keeps your emphasis on the value of work, on your responsibilities here in this earth. Take joy in that. If you can find a career that you actually enjoy, that you prosper in, that's great. Not everybody gets that. And if you do, then thank God for that and pursue that. But give your diligence to your work rather than trying to find ways to get out of work. I think that is a major problem of what we see in our culture today. The whole win the lottery kind of culture. Anything but work. Anything to give us an excuse to not show up for work on a given day. That's exactly the opposite of what the Bible teaches. An attitude of service, not just promoting myself, making sure that I get out there and get all the headlines and the popularity and the money and all that, but finding ways to put ourselves in positions to serve other people. Galatians chapter 5 and verse number 14 and following. For you were called to freedom, brethren, only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. There is certainly a sense in which we can see our success as coming at the expense of somebody else. And if we are blessed in our society, if we are blessed materially or in any other kind of way, we need to be finding ways to turn that toward other people, and certainly turning it toward God himself, finding ways to serve rather than to want to be served all the time. And of course, there's all kinds of extreme and ridiculous stories about celebrities who think that they are the ones who are at the top of the pedestal. They must be served all the time. It's all about what I can get, what's me, and no concern at all, as far as we can tell, with the needs of other people. That's not God's plan. And of course, purity. Showing ourselves an example of the believers in purity in many other ways. Paul tells Timothy in chapter 4 of Timothy, verse 12. This is who we are, pursuing pure things, pure thoughts, trying to exclude ungodliness from our lives. We realize we can't do it completely or all effectively. There are going to be problems. There's going to be ungodliness in the world, and we are going to be exposed to it from time to time. What we have to do is stand apart from that and be an example of the opposite of that, so that perhaps people can be drawn to Jesus and to Jesus' values rather than the world's idols. It may very well be that the show is called American Idol for a reason. It is idolatrous in many aspects, and we have to find a way to reject, if not the show itself, at least the principles that go behind this rampant entertainment culture that we see over and over again in our culture. Anyway, that's what I've been hearing.
If you want to stop listening at this point and go your way, I hope you've found the message instructive, inspiring, and most of all, faithful to God's Word. Please don't forget to like, rate, share, subscribe, and follow. But if you stick around for a few more minutes, I would like to share with you a way to amuse yourself in a wholesome manner while waiting here in Satan's world, and perhaps pick up a spiritual point or two in the process. This is what I've been playing.
Stake your fortunes in the mysterious island world of Bora Bora. Journey across islands, building huts where the resilient men and women of your tribes can settle, discovering fishing grounds and collecting shells. Send priests to the temples and gather offerings to curry favor with the gods. Okay, there it is, right there at the end of the description. That's the rub, as it were, with regard to one of our favorite thinky kind of games that we're playing these days, a game called Bora Bora. And it's like a lot of these games that you find in stores these days. It's got a theme on it in theory. Okay, you're settling Bora Bora. That's what you're doing. Okay, what does that mean? Well, you're collecting shells and you're building huts and you're fishing and okay, I guess you are. Yeah, I was reading that description and I thought to myself, I don't know how many times I've played Bora Bora now, 5 or 6 times. Something like that. I guess that kind of is what we're doing. I really hadn't thought about it very much. It doesn't feel like you're settling Bora Bora. It feels like you're playing a board game. And that's not meant as some kind of excuse. That's not meant as some kind of refusal to acknowledge reality. It's embracing reality, in fact. Generally, board games, the ones we like the most anyway, have some kind of at least nominal theme. It's about something. It lends character to the game. It lends background. It hopefully provides some decent artwork. A game about Bora Bora you would think would look pretty, and it kind of does. But sometimes that theme comes back to bite you. In this particular case is what I wanted to talk about while we bring it up in the context of idolatry, because there is, at least nominally, some kind of idol service going on. And we are opposed to that. If you hadn't picked that up yet in this podcast, I'll tell you outright, we are opposed to idolatry. We're opposed to paganism in the Hammons house. And at least on the surface, Bora Bora contains paganism. Now, I think that we would all agree that at a certain level, acknowledgement of of idolatry or drunkenness or violence or whatever it happens to be becomes sanctioning that thing. When you, whether it's entertainment or the work that you choose to do, whatever it happens to be, at a certain point you begin giving credence to that thing. I think we would probably all also agree that simply acknowledging that it exists, living in the same sphere as this, does not necessarily give credence to that thing. The question is where we're going to draw a line. When we're going to live in the devil's world, we're going to live among sinful people who do sinful things. Clearly, we must draw a line, and that's lesson number one. You need to draw a line. If you're going to be cohabiting with sin in some fashion, set a boundary. What the Jews of Jesus' day would have called a hedge, building a hedge around the law. Honor your father and mother. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Those are kind of vague concepts. What does that actually look like? How do you go about doing that? Well, they would build a hedge around the law that was practical in nature. If you do these things, you will be respecting your parents. You will be respecting the Sabbath law. It's a practical exercise, and generally speaking, when done properly and when done in the context of God's law and God's principles, in harmony with all the other things that God has told us to do, it's a good and profitable thing. And I strongly encourage you, with regard to the entertainment that you choose, the places you go to eat, the movies you watch, whatever, that you consider making hard and fast lines and then not crossing those lines. Now, does that mean that any kind of association at all, say in a board game, for instance, with what would appear to be paganism is necessarily evil? No, it's not. And I mentioned in the open how we were going to talk about how we go about drawing the line. Let me give you some principles that go around in my mind when I'm considering what board game is appropriate or not appropriate for my family. And by the way, we reject an awful lot of games just on the surface. Games that are about the devil. Games that celebrate wickedness, as it were, by its very nature. We steer clear of that. But in Bora Bora, at no point do we offer up some kind of sacrifice to some pagan god. In fact, you really have to work hard to see the idols in there at all. There's some statues. You go to a certain space and you visit a statue or you build a statue or whatever. It doesn't feel at all like idol worship. Is it idol worship? Well, the questions that I ask myself are kind of like this. Are these gods going to actually be served by my actions? Am I going to do something in the process of this game or watching this movie or whatever that's going to honor this god? Because there can only be one God and the only one Lord in our life. Luke 16 verse 13, you can't serve God and money, and other passages also. Whatever I do has to honor God. If it's honoring some other god, then I've crossed the line. I need to not do that. Am I actually promoting ungodliness? Would somebody look at my behavior, an average person, look at my behavior and say this person is standing for ungodliness? I would venture to say that most of you, if you are in the habit of playing board games, probably don't even consider these things. And I think most people are like that. I know people who consider themselves very fervent Christians who will play any number of games that I draw a line on. That's not to make me I'm holier than they are or anything like that, but to emphasize that there is a disconnect between what the game says it's about and what we're actually feeling. If I cross that disconnect, if I connect somehow with ungodly values, I've gone too far. I need to be a good example. I need to be focusing on those things that are pure and holy and righteous. Philippians 4 verse 8 and many other passages talk about that. Is my influence being compromised? It's not just a matter of am I sinning? Am I encouraging somebody else to sin? Am I giving a go-ahead to something that would be reasonably assumed by some people to be sinful? I need to not do that. I need to steer clear of meat sacrificed to idols. The text says in 1 Corinthians 8 verse 13, if that's this non-moral thing, something that's not sinful, if it's going to encourage somebody to go to hell, I'll never eat meat again, he says. Likewise, I'm perfectly willing and eager, in fact, to give up some form of entertainment that's going to encourage somebody to reject the principles of God. If you think that playing Bora Bora is doing that, I will not play Bora Bora in your presence. I won't invite you to play Bora Bora either. And the other couple of games that we have that touch on this theme also. Nothing that we do should be in any way encouraging ungodliness in ourselves or in others. If we're able to make an informed, God-centered decision, we can not only steer clear of sin in our entertainment, but we can also set good habits for ourselves to steer clear of ungodliness as much as we possibly can in a sinful and ungodly world. Anyway, that's what I've been playing.
Thank you for listening to the Citizen of Heaven podcast. If you profited from your time here, I have a few requests of you. Please pray for me and for this work. We need more citizens of heaven, and our prayer is that we be part of achieving this objective. Please subscribe to this podcast, and give a good rating on iTunes and other sites that allow you to do such things, and spread the word to your friends. Please follow my work through my website, www.halhammons.com. There you'll find links to articles, videos, and books of mine. Seek me out on social media. You can find me on Instagram, YouTube, and especially Facebook. Look for me and for my pages, The Final Word, The Preacher, 20 Pages a Week, and Citizen of Heaven. Until next time, be strong and courageous, fight the good fight of faith, and do all things in the name of the Lord Jesus. This is Hal Hammons, the Citizen of Heaven, signing off.